I found out my husband booked a romantic dinner for his mistress. So I reserved the next table and brought her husband with me. My name is Esther. I am 43 years old. I work as a senior account manager at a marketing firm in Houston, Texas. Before you judge me, I need you to put yourself in my shoes. Imagine giving 20 years of your life to one person, staying loyal and committed, choosing them every single day, standing by them through the ups and downs of life, only to discover that your love, loyalty, and sacrifice had been repaid with betrayal. What will you do? Just think about it for a moment. Please, I need you to understand that whatever my decision was after discovering my husband's betrayal did not come from a place of rage. It came from 20 years of showing up as a loyal wife, standing by my man through every season, only to realize that my faithfulness had been met with betrayal. It came from the quiet heartbreak of giving your best for 2 decades and discovering it was never valued the way it should have been. This is my story. Please grab your popcorn and watch till the end. You can't afford to miss this story.
Anthony and I met when I was 23. I was already working independent and steady in my career. He was 30 at the time, working as a mid-level associate at a law firm downtown. We married after a year of dating. From the outside, our life looked solid. We had a comfortable home in the suburbs of Houston, 2 dependable incomes, and the kind of yearly vacations people plan months in advance and post about with smiling photos. Our friends described us as stable and lucky, but what people saw was only the surface. Beneath it, small cracks had been forming for a year. The conversations between Anthony and me had grown shorter, the silences longer. The warmth that once came naturally started to feel forced. Anthony started missing dinners and keeping late nights. I noticed the changes, of course I did, and when I tried to talk to Anthony about it, work became his constant explanation. For everything, late nights, missed dinners, canceled plans, all of it was blamed on the firm. I accepted it for 1 whole year so that peace would reign in my home. But on that fateful Tuesday evening, I realized it had never been just about long work hours. That evening, Anthony was in the shower. The sound of water running echoed from the bathroom, steady and distant, a backdrop to the ordinary quiet of a Tuesday night. I was sitting in the bedroom, still in my work clothes, scrolling through nothing in particular the way you do at the end of a long day when your body has arrived home, but your mind is still somewhere on the freeway. His phone was on the nightstand. He had left it there carelessly, face up, which I registered somewhere at the edge of my attention without thinking much of it. Anthony had not been leaving his phone face up for months. It had become one of those small habitual changes I had noticed and filed away under things that didn't matter. I had never been the type to check my husband's phone. Trust was something I had always protected. In myself, in my marriage, in the version of Anthony I had spent 20 years choosing to believe in. Checking his phone felt like a line I would not cross, a line that once crossed could not be uncrossed. But the phone lit up, and intuition, that vague instinct you only believe when the pain cuts deep enough, pulled me up from my seat. I leaned forward and read the notification on the screen. Reservation confirmed. Table for 2 at Maison Verlaine on Friday, 8 p.m. Window seat as requested. She's going to love it. I sat completely still. In fact, I was frozen. Maison Verlaine was one of the most expensive restaurants in Houston. We had once dreamed of going there for our 10th anniversary, but canceled it because Anthony had a work trip. I had never set foot in the place, yet now he was planning a romantic evening there for someone else. I did not plan to unlock his phone. I want to be honest about that, but at that moment, I was so confused and just needed answers. One moment, my hands were in my lap, and the next moment, they were holding his phone and entering his passcode. It was our wedding date. He had never thought to change it because I have never given him reasons to do that. I had always believed marriage was simple, built on trust and honesty, but what I found was an entirely different world, one that had been running in parallel to mine for one whole year. Messages, photographs, voice notes, and full conversations that spanned months with a young blonde woman who worked in the client relations department at his firm. They talked daily, hourly, about the most intimate little things from morning coffee to evening plans, about the nightwear she would wear to sleep when she was taking her bath, about the small frustrations of a Tuesday afternoon, and about the dress she wore to a work event, and whether he had noticed. The woman in those messages was named Susan. Just like I said previously, she worked in the client relations department at Anthony's firm. She was my schoolmate in college, and for 20 years after graduation, I hadn't seen her again. One Saturday 2 years ago, I ran into her at a mall. We stood in the middle of a busy walkway and caught up for 20 minutes. She told me she had been out of work for 3 years, that she had stepped away from her career when her children were small and had never found her way back into a professional environment, that the gap on her resume was making every application feel like sending something into silence, that she had started to feel like she was disappearing inside her own life. She was frustrated in the way that 3 years of financial dependence and professional invisibility will make a person. I saw in her a woman who had not given up but was running out of ways to keep trying. And I thought, with the uncomplicated goodwill of someone who simply wants to help, that I might be able to open a door for her. As it happened, there was an opening in the client relations department at Anthony's firm, a mid-level account coordinator role that I genuinely believed was well suited to her background, the kind of role that could genuinely rebuild both her skills and her confidence if she approached it right. I mentioned it to Anthony that same evening. He said he would look into it. I helped her write a suited application. A few weeks later, after I had followed up twice, Susan was called in for an interview. I helped her prepare for the interview and wrote her a personal recommendation. I made a phone call to someone I trusted at the firm and put my professional reputation behind her name. She was hired shortly after. The change in her was immediate and visible. She walked differently, spoke about herself differently, carried herself like a woman who had remembered what it felt like to have a place in the world beyond her own four walls. The flat, frustrated woman I had reconnected with at the mall, worn down by years of financial dependence and the quiet indignity of having no income of her own, no professional identity, and no corner of the world that belonged specifically to her, that woman began to disappear, replaced by a financially stable woman who could foot her bills without running to her husband for money to buy everything, including her menstrual pads. I was glad for her. I had believed I had done something good. Now, looking at her photographs with my husband, I understood that I had actually pushed my husband's mistress right inside his arms. There were photos from a 2-day work trip to San Antonio 3 months ago, a client event Anthony had told me was a mandatory firm commitment, the kind of thing he couldn't get out of even if he wanted to. Now, I realized it was all a lie. It was all a gateway with his mistress. In one photo, he was sitting in a hotel restaurant, relaxed in a way I had not seen him in years, Susan curled up in Anthony's arms. His smile, so bright I barely recognized the man who I stood by through his financial crisis in 2004, and even paid for his mother's kidney transplant when everyone, including his relatives, turned their backs on him. His smile in those photos was bright and foreign in a way that made me feel like I was looking at someone else's husband, someone else's life. I still remember how it felt like the air had vanished from the room, replaced by a piercing metallic ringing in my ears. I wanted to throw the phone across the room, to scream at the top of my voice, but I stood there, my knuckles white and heart pounding wildly. The shower was still running. I put his phone back on the nightstand, face up, exactly where he had left it. I stood up and walked to the window and looked out at the suburban street below, the familiar row of houses, the orange glow of the street lamps, a neighbor's car reversing slowly out of a driveway. Everything seems exactly as it had been 10 minutes ago, yet nothing, not one single thing, is the same. The shower turned off. I heard him moving around in the bathroom, the sound of the mirror cabinet opening and closing, the particular rhythm of a man going through the end of his evening routine without a care in the world. I walked back to the bed and sat down and folded my hands in my lap. He came out of the bathroom, toweling his hair, glanced at me briefly, and asked, "Have you seen my blue tie? The good one." It is in the second drawer, I said. Left side. My voice came out even. Steady. I don't entirely know how. Thanks, he said, and went to the drawer without looking at me again. That night, I lay beside him with my back turned, listening to his breathing slow and deepen into the long, unbothered rhythm of a man with no particular reason to lie awake. My body was rigid. My mind was not quiet. It was moving fast and cold, and with a clarity I had not felt in years, running through everything I had explained away, everything I had accepted, everything I had chosen not to see. How many times had I told myself his distance was just work pressure? How many times had I noticed the unfamiliar scent on a shirt, the too casual explanation for a late night, the way he sometimes looked at his phone and then looked at me with an awkward expression? How many times had my own instincts tried to tell me something and I had overruled them with trust? Now I knew every suspicion, every gut feeling had been right, and I was no longer the blind wife. The next morning I kissed him goodbye, the way I always did, and wished him good luck with the Chinese clients he had a call with that morning. He nodded, completely unaware that I had already seen the candlelit dinner plans he made for Susan on Friday night. The moment his car left the driveway, I sat down at the kitchen table with my phone and called my office. I requested 3 days of leave. I needed time, not to cry, but to prepare. I had spent 20 years being the perfect wife, but now I was going to be someone else. I poured myself a second cup of coffee that I did not drink. Anthony had made a reservation at the most beautiful restaurant in Houston for the woman he had been betraying me with for nearly a year, and I was going to let him have that evening. I was just going to make sure it was nothing like what he had planned. I had spent 20 years being the perfect woman, a good wife. I don't even blow my trumpet at all. I had been a supportive and loving wife to the core. I thought of the sacrifices I had for Anthony. I was there for him when his father died. We had been married for a month and were still on our honeymoon when we got the devastating news. Anthony fell apart in a way that I don't think even he had anticipated. He stopped eating properly. He was hallucinating. He sat in darkened rooms for days at a time and could not explain, even to himself, why he couldn't climb out of it. I stood by him all through, not minding that our honeymoon, a time we were meant to spend the most intimate times of our lives, had just been cut short. I sat beside him in that darkness for as long as it required, and I handled everything around him. The funeral arrangements, the relatives who needed to be contacted, the firm that needed careful updates about his absence, and the house that still needed to function like a house, all of it quietly, without complaint, without ever making him feel like a burden to me. That is what love looked like to me. You stand by your loved ones. 3 years into our marriage, his business venture failed. He had invested heavily in a private consultancy he had believed in deeply, and when it collapsed, it took a significant portion of our shared savings with it. The financial loss was serious, but what broke Anthony more than the money was what it did to his sense of himself, the confidence he had built his identity around, the belief that he was a man capable of creating something, of providing, of being someone who built rather than lost. I watched that drain out of him, and I refused to let it stay gone. I covered our bills from my own salary. I took on freelance accounts in the evenings after my regular workday was finished. I did not complain about the exhaustion or the pressure or the fact that I was effectively carrying 2 people on 1 income while managing the emotional weight of a husband who had temporarily lost faith in himself. Every morning I told him it was temporary. Every morning I told him I believed in him, not because I was performing optimism, but because I had decided with the full weight of a deliberate choice that I was not going to let us sink, that if one of us had to hold the rope, I would hold it for as long as necessary. God, should I even talk about how I emptied my savings account just to pay for his mother's kidney transplant? I also sat in that hospital waiting room for 6 hours while his mother was in surgery, and I held his hand the entire time, and I did not once, not for a single moment, allow him to feel overwhelmed or alone. I loved Anthony with my whole heart for a good 20 years, only to be betrayed in the most painful way I could ever have imagined. And Susan, the woman spat on my face as a repayment for my kindness. The woman whom I had pulled out of 3 years of invisibility and had handed back her confidence, her income, her sense of self, and given her every tool she needed to rebuild her life. And she had used those tools to dismantle mine. There is a specific kind of pain that comes from helping someone who needs it and having them turn around and treat your kindness as something to be exploited rather than honored. It is different from ordinary betrayal. It has an extra layer, a humiliation that sits beneath the hurt, the feeling of having been seen as naive and stupid. It makes you question not just the person who betrayed you, but the impulse that led you to help them in the first place. It makes generosity feel dangerous in retrospect. And that is a particular kind of damage, the kind that doesn't just hurt you in the present, but reaches back and poisons something good you did in the past. I was not going to let it do that to me permanently. I was not going to let them get away with this. In less than 12 hours, the life I thought I understood had been laid open. Everything I trusted felt exposed. But I didn't fall apart. Something else settled inside me. Not rage, not hysteria, just a sharp, steady kind of clarity. I did not want a screaming match. I didn't want to be the woman who smashes plates and yells loudly only to be met with pity and another robotic apology that he would give because he was caught. No, I am also not interested in receiving any well-constructed lies from Anthony. If Anthony wanted a special night at Maison Verlaine, he would have it, just not the version he planned. I opened his email. He had linked it to our shared home network years ago and had never revisited that decision because Anthony had always operated on the comfortable assumption that I was too trusting to look. His calendar was meticulous, as if he never expected anyone to find it. 7:30 p.m. Friday. Reservation at Maison Verlaine. Noted clearly, window seat, soft lighting, and wine are prearranged. A perfect evening for two people with nothing to hide except their spouses. His calendar was neat, organized, and confident, as if he never imagined I would see it. Friday, 7:30 p.m. Reservation confirmed. Window seat, soft lighting, wine pre-selected. Every detail arranged for a romantic evening between two people pretending they had nothing to hide. I looked at it for a long moment. Then I opened a browser tab and pulled up Susan's LinkedIn profile, professional headshot, polished summary, and 200 connections she had built in the years since I helped her walk back into the workforce. I looked at it without feeling very much. What I felt about Susan could wait. There would be time for that later. One more click. I found her husband, who is her mutual connection. Peter Aldridge. He is a structural engineer in downtown Houston with 15 years of steady and solid professional history. He had posted 3 weeks ago about a community development project his firm had completed in the 3rd Ward and had personally replied to over a dozen comments with the genuine, unhurried engagement of a man who takes his work seriously and treats people like they are worth his time. I looked at his face on that screen for a long time. He had no idea. He was living inside a version of his marriage that had been quietly and deliberately rewritten around him, the same way I had been living inside mine. He was a man who still trusted the person sleeping beside him. I could see it in his expression, in the openness of his headshot, and in the way he engaged publicly with the world. The unguarded quality of someone who has not yet learned that the people closest to you are capable of this particular kind of deception. He deserved to know in a way that was undeniable, in a room where the truth was sitting directly in front of him, and there was nowhere for anyone to look away. Of course, I couldn't just call a stranger and say, "Your wife is sneaking around with my husband." I needed a different approach that is subtle, believable, and effective. Peter was a structural engineer with a recently completed, publicly visible project. I was a senior account manager with 15 years of professional relationships in this city. I knew exactly what a credible, well-constructed business email looked like. I had written hundreds of them. So I opened my email account and crafted the perfect, formal, concise, and completely professional email. Dear Mr. Aldridge, my name is Esther Beaumont. I am a senior account manager at Meridian Marketing Group here in Houston. We are currently developing a community impact campaign for a client in the urban development sector, and your recent work on the Third Ward project caught our attention. We believe your perspective would add genuine value to an introductory dinner conversation we are hosting this Friday. If your schedule allows, I would love to meet at Maison Verlaine on Friday, 8 p.m. This is entirely no obligation. We simply feel your work speaks for itself. Warm regards, Esther Beaumont. I read it back 3 times. Professional, specific enough to be credible. I hit send. Then I waited. 43 minutes later, Peter Aldridge replied, Dear Ms. Beaumont, thank you for reaching out. I am very interested in this opportunity. Friday at 8 p.m. at Maison Verlaine works well. I look forward to the conversation. Best, Peter Aldridge. He had said yes. I read that line over and over, my heart pounding with a strange mix of nerves and sorrow. He didn't know yet, but he would. Not through anger, but through the clarity of truth. He was going to walk into that restaurant believing he was attending a professional dinner. He was going to sit across from me, hoping to talk about urban development and community impact, while 6 feet away, his wife would be sitting with her boyfriend, who is also my husband, having the romantic evening they believed was entirely and safely private. I closed the laptop and picked up my phone. I need to book a table at Maison Verlaine. I called the restaurant. The receptionist picked up. Good afternoon. How can I help you? She asked. I would like to make a reservation for Friday evening. I said, 2 guests, 8 o'clock. Do you have a seating preference? I kept my voice completely even, near the window if possible, and I believe a colleague has a reservation for the same evening, under the name Beaumont. If there's a table available nearby, that would be lovely. We're working on a shared project. It was a half-truth, and it worked. Certainly, ma'am, I'll seat you near them. Perfect, I said. Thank you. Any special requests, wine, or menu preferences? Just a good view, I said, smiling to myself. I hung up and sat still for a long moment. Mission accomplished. Everything was in place. Friday was 2 days away. Peter and I would sit close enough to see every expression, every movement on their faces, close enough to shatter the illusion they had built in the dark. Everything was ready. No screaming, no accusations, just a quiet, devastating reveal, perfectly timed. Anthony always thought I was soft. He was wrong. And Friday night would prove it. I walked to the bedroom, opened the closet, and found the black dress at the very back, still in its garment bag, never worn outside the house. Anthony had seen it once and said it was probably a little too much for a regular evening out. I had put it away without argument and had not taken it out since. I unzipped the garment bag and looked at it. Then I hung it on the outside of the closet door, where I would see it every morning until Friday. I arrived at Maison Verlaine 20 minutes early. I had driven there alone, parked 2 blocks away, and walked the rest in the October night air, not because I needed the walk, but because I needed those few minutes between the car and the door. A few minutes where I was neither the woman who had just spent 3 days planning this, nor the woman who was about to walk into it. Just a woman on a sidewalk, breathing, putting one foot in front of the other. I wore the black dress, the one Anthony had seen once and called a little too much for a regular evening out. I had paired it with heels I had bought 2 years ago and never worn outside the box. Simple black, the kind of shoe that means business without announcing it. My hair was pulled back in a soft bun, my makeup understated. I had not dressed to impress anyone. I had not dressed to be looked at or admired or noticed in the way a woman sometimes dresses when she wants to feel better about herself. I dressed for battle, and tonight's battlefield was a 5-star restaurant lit by candlelight, dressed in white linen, with the soft sound of a live violin floating through the warm air and crystal glasses catching the light from every direction. Like everything in this room was designed to make people believe they were living inside something beautiful. Some of them were about to find out they weren't. The hostess led me to my table, the adjacent table, exactly as arranged, positioned with a clean sight line to the window, table 6 feet away. Anthony and Susan's table. It was still empty and perfectly set. A small vase of white flowers at its center. A wine glass already turned right side up in anticipation of the evening someone had planned so carefully for someone who was not his wife. I sat down, smoothed the dress across my lap, accepted the menu with a thank you, and ordered a glass of sparkling water because I needed my head completely clear tonight, and I did not trust myself with anything else. My chest was tight. I want to be honest about that. I had spent 3 days preparing for this moment with the focus and precision of someone who had decided that falling apart was not an available option. And now that the moment had almost arrived, my body was reminding me that preparation and composure are not the same thing as feeling nothing. I was not afraid. That is important to say clearly. The tightness in my chest was not fear. It was the specific, physical weight of finally arriving at a truth I had been circling for months without letting myself land on it. The truth of a marriage that had been hollow long before I found those messages. A friendship that had been a performance from the very beginning, and 20 years of loyalty that had been quietly, methodically taken advantage of by the two people most positioned to know its value. I breathed through it. At 7:48, Peter Aldridge walked in. He was taller than his LinkedIn photo suggested, broad-shouldered, composed, wearing a dark jacket over a simple shirt. He had the unhurried look of a man who is used to meeting new people professionally and does not find it stressful. I stood as he approached and we shook hands, and I looked at his face and saw exactly what I had seen in his photograph. Open, steady, genuinely present. The eyes of a man who still believed, with no particular reason to question it, that the world was roughly what it appeared to be. He had no idea. "Miss Beaumont," he said, with a warm and easy smile. "I'm glad we could make this work on short notice." "Thank you for coming," I said, and I meant it in more ways than I could explain to him yet. "Please sit down." "The pleasure's mine. The topic you brought up really intrigued me," he replied and took the seat across from me. We settled into the kind of opening conversation that professional dinners are built on: his recent project, the challenges of community center design, and the gap between what urban development promises and what it delivers to the people actually living inside it. Peter spoke with genuine passion about his work. He was thoughtful and specific, and not the kind of man who talks about himself without also asking questions. And under any other circumstances, I think I would have found him genuinely interesting company. I listened, nodded, responded, and asked the right questions, but my eyes kept drifting toward the entrance. And I watched the entrance. At 8:09, the door opened. Anthony came in first. He was wearing the charcoal jacket I had picked out with him at a department store 2 years ago, one of those unremarkable Saturday afternoon shopping trips that you do not know, at the time, you will remember. He had his phone in his hand, tucking it into his pocket as he crossed the threshold, and there was an ease to his movement, a looseness in his shoulders, that I recognized as the specific physical posture of a man who believes he is completely safe. Behind him, one step back, was Susan, walking confidently as if the world revolved around her. She wore a tight-fitting red dress, her hair down, her earrings catching the light. Anthony pulled out a chair for her, When they were both seated, he leaned close to her and whispered something in her ear. She blushed instantly, smiling in that shy, excited way, like a girl being asked out for the first time. I tightened my fingers around my glass and kept my voice steady as I continued talking to Peter. He was gentle and attentive, too polite to see that I was barely holding myself together. Across the room, Anthony leaned toward her as he reached for the wine menu, his hand brushing Susan's wrist like it belonged there. She smiled up at him and tilted her head, the candlelight catching the small diamonds in her ears. Then I reached for my napkin, and when I looked up, my eyes met his. I watched him freeze at the spot as it dawned on him that his wife was sitting at the table next to his. His hand tightened on the wine menu. Susan had not yet seen me. She was looking at the table setting, adjusting something, entirely unaware of the shift that had just moved through the man sitting across from her, like a current through water. Peter, his back to their table, was still talking about a planning commission meeting he had attended the previous month. I nodded and kept my eyes on his face and said something appropriate, and heard none of it. Then Susan looked up. She followed Anthony's frozen gaze across the room, and she saw me. I watched her face change instantly. She was shocked. Her mouth fell open slightly, her eyes wide, like she had stopped breathing for a second. Beneath the shock, beneath the color draining from her face, I saw guilt. I held her gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Then I turned back to Peter and said quietly and calmly, "Would you excuse me for just one moment? I need to step away, briefly." He nodded and said, "Of course." I stood up, smoothed my dress, and walked toward the back of the restaurant in the direction of the restrooms. I did not look at Anthony's and Susan's tables as I passed them. I did not need to. I could feel Anthony's eyes following me, with the desperate attention of a man trying to calculate what is happening and finding no reassuring answer. I was standing near the corridor that led to the private dining area when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around. It was Susan. She had followed me. I had not expected that, and I want to be honest about that surprise. I had prepared for many versions of how this evening might unfold, but Susan walking toward me of her own volition in a tight red dress with tears already forming in her eyes was not one of them. She stopped a few feet away. Her face was the color of something washed out. "Esther." Her voice was barely above a whisper. Just my name. As if she were confirming I was real. I looked at her. This woman I had helped. This woman whose resume I had rewritten and whose confidence I had helped rebuild. "Susan," I said. My voice came out completely level. "Please." She glanced back toward the dining room. "Not here. Not like this." I tilted my head slightly. "Why not?" I kept my tone conversational. "Calm. The way you speak to someone when you have already decided that their comfort is no longer something you are responsible for. The candlelight is beautiful. The music is lovely. You helped choose this restaurant, didn't you? It seems like exactly the right setting." Her lips trembled. "I never wanted to hurt you." "I know," I said, and the terrible thing was that I believed her in the shallow, self-serving way that people who do hurtful things often genuinely don't want to be the kind of person who does hurtful things. But Peter deserves to know, doesn't he? I glanced back toward our table, where Peter had his back to us, and was looking at his phone. He's sitting right there, less than 10 steps away. He came here tonight thinking he was having a professional dinner. I paused. He has no idea who you're really having dinner with. Susan opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. She turned as if to run, but Anthony was already behind her, his face white. He had followed her, of course he had, and he stood in the corridor in his charcoal jacket, looking at me with an expression I had never seen on his face in 20 years of marriage. Not anger, not defiance, something closer to the look of a man who has just watched the floor he was standing on open up beneath him. "Esther." His voice was different from Susan's, tighter, lower, the voice of someone trying to maintain control of a situation they already know they have lost. "What are you doing here?" It was not a question. It was the last attempt of a man who hopes, against all available evidence, that there is still an explanation that makes this less than what it is. I looked at him for a moment, the face of a betrayal and a cheat. Then I turned and walked back toward our table. "Peter," I said as I reached him. He looked up from his phone. "Could you come with me for a moment? There's something I need to show you." He read my face. Something in my expression communicated that this was not about urban development or marketing campaigns, and to his credit, he did not ask questions. He stood quietly and followed me. We walked back to where Anthony and Susan were still standing in the corridor. Susan had her arms folded across herself. Anthony had gone very still. Peter stopped when he saw them. I watched his eyes move from the couple in front of him to my face and back again, processing and calculating as he tried to put the pieces together. The entire restaurant seemed to freeze in that breathless moment. "Peter," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "This is my husband, Anthony, and I believe you know the woman standing beside him." The silence that followed was unlike any silence I have experienced before or since. It was not empty. It was full of the weight of everything that was about to change for all four people standing in that corridor, full of the sound of the violins still playing somewhere in the dining room, full of the distant murmur of other people's evenings continuing undisturbed around the edges of ours. Peter looked at Susan. Susan looked at the floor. And I watched Peter's face do something that Anthony's had not done, and that Susan's had not done. I watched it go very, very still in the way of a man absorbing something enormous without any of the dramatics that enormous things are supposed to produce. No raised voice. No outburst. Just a man standing in a candlelit corridor in a restaurant. He had come in good faith, looking at his wife in another man's company and quietly, permanently understanding his wife was having an affair. "How long?" Peter asked, looking at Susan. His voice was barely above a murmur, but it carried. Susan's eyes were now filled with tears. "Peter," she tried to call out. "How long?" Peter asked again. His composure was still calm, but hurt was written all over his face. She didn't answer, which was its own answer. I turned and walked away, leaving them sitting there in the mess they had created. But before I did, I looked at them and said calmly, "Don't worry. Dinner is still on Anthony. Tonight will be fun as you and Susan had planned." I walked out with my head up. Behind me were untouched glasses of wine, half-spoken excuses, and two unfaithful people who had just realized their secret was no longer safe. When I made my way back toward the main dining area, Peter was still standing. Susan clung to Anthony's arm, her face drained of color. He looked just as pale. They both looked like people who had been pulled out of a pleasant illusion and dropped into something real and unforgiving. I signaled to the waiter, "I need a private room." I said, steady but firm, "And please merge our table with Mr. Anthony Hamilton's. We have a few things to discuss." He hesitated for a second, then nodded. "Right away, ma'am." Within minutes, we were escorted into a quiet private room. I sat down first. Peter sat beside me. Anthony and Susan sat across from each other, rigid, pale, like two people waiting for a verdict they had already written themselves. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then Anthony broke the silence first. "Esther." His voice was rough in a way I had not heard before. "I don't even know where to start." "Start 3 days ago," I said, pouring water into my glass with a steady hand. "Tuesday evening. You were in the shower. Your phone was on the nightstand. When you got the reservation confirmation, I happened to see it on your screen. That's when I knew." Both of them froze. Susan looked down, and Anthony opened his mouth to speak, but I raised my hand. "You don't need a monologue." Both of them went completely still. I read everything. "Anthony." I kept my voice even, not cold. I want to be precise about that because cold implies a performance, and I was not performing anything. I was simply stating facts. Every message, every photograph, every plan you made, and every lie that covered it. I know about the secret trips to San Antonio. I know how long this has been happening. I know that while I was at home believing we were fine, you were building something else entirely. I paused. So please don't sit there and try to find a starting point that makes this something other than what it is. Susan whispered, I'm sorry. The words fell out of her, like something that had been pressing against the inside of her chest for a long time and had finally found an exit. Esther, I am so sorry. I looked at her. I thought all the sacrifices I had made to make sure she became financially stable, only for her to repay me with cruel betrayal. I know you are, I said, but sorry doesn't change what you chose. Every day for 1 whole year, you made a choice and lived by it. That is not a mistake. That is a direction you voluntarily chose. I turned to Peter. He's my husband, I said, nodding towards Anthony, and she's your wife. The least we deserve is the truth, said to our faces. Peter sat still, eyes locked on Susan like he didn't recognize his own wife. What are you going to tell me? That it was a mistake? That you were confused? Or that you were just finding yourself? Because clearly you found quite a lot in the arms of another woman's husband. Susan wept. I never meant for it to go this far. It started as a joke. I felt lost and unappreciated at home. Anthony gave me the attention that I deserve. He listened to me. Peter let out a breath beside me. Short, sharp, involuntary. He was looking at Susan with an expression that I recognized from the inside because I had been wearing a version of it for 3 days. The expression of someone dismantling a version of reality they had believed in completely. I was there for you, Susan, Peter said, his voice cracking. I gave you all the attention you needed and even quit working on weekends just to stay home with you. How could you say you felt lost and unappreciated when I do literally everything to make you feel loved and seen? Susan wept profusely, her shoulders shaking and her hands over her mouth. She couldn't say another word aside from muttering, I am sorry. Anthony turned to me. His eyes were red at the edges. He said, Esther, I know I have hurt you deeply. I know what I destroyed. I know it. And I'm asking you, I'm begging you to please forgive me. Don't let this be the end of us. I will do anything. I will end it completely. I will go to counseling. I will do anything at all to correct this mess. Anthony, I said, saying his name gently, not with anger, not with contempt, but with the specific, quiet finality of a woman who has already made her decision and no longer needs to defend it. The end didn't begin tonight. It began the first time you chose her over the vows you made to me. The first time you looked at her the way you used to look at me and decided that was something you were allowed to pursue. Tonight is not the ending. Tonight is just the first night you know that I know. He lowered his head. I reached into my purse and placed a hotel key card on the table. I've booked a room at the Whitfield tonight. You're welcome to go home if you still have the nerve. I'll return Monday morning. I would ask that you not be at the house when I return. Esther, please, Anthony said with pleading eyes. Please don't do this. I'll do anything to fix it. You can't fix a house that's rotten at the foundation. I replied, I used to think that being the kind of woman who forgives everything was a virtue. I spent 20 years believing that. I was there when your father died. I paid for your mother's surgery when your own family turned their backs. I carried us through the years when you couldn't carry yourself. I paused briefly and let that sink into his head. And then I continued, and I don't say that to punish you. I say it because I need you to understand what I am walking away from. I know exactly what I built. I know exactly what I am leaving. And I am leaving it anyway, because I have finally understood that forgiving everything is not strength. Sometimes it is just a slower way of losing yourself. The room was so quiet that you could hear a pin drop. I turned to Peter. His eyes were fixed on the middle distance, somewhere between the present and whatever version of his life he had been living before he walked into this restaurant. "I am truly sorry, Mr. Peter," I said to him, "for how you found out. For all of it." He nodded once, slowly. When he met my eyes, there was no anger in his expression toward me. Only the exhausted, hollow look of a man who has just had the ground removed from beneath him and has not yet figured out where to stand. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Thank you for showing me the truth. It hurts, but I needed it." I stood and smoothed my dress. "I wish you both luck, not because I forgive you, but because every choice comes with consequences. And sooner or later, everyone reaps what they've sown." I picked up my purse and walked out of Maison Verlaine without looking back. And trust me, the proudest thing I did was walking out on my own terms. The sound of my heels on the stone pavement outside was sharp and clean in the night air, each step deliberate, each step carrying me further from the candlelight and the violin and the private room where I had left two unfaithful people sitting in the wreckage of the choices they had made. The October night was cool and still. The upscale street was quiet at this hour, just the amber glow of restaurant windows and the occasional passing car. I walked to my car and sat in it for a moment without starting the engine. My hands were in my lap. My clutch bag with the Whitfield Hotel key card was on the passenger seat. I started the engine and drove. The Whitfield Hotel received me the way good hotels always do, with quiet efficiency and no unnecessary questions. The front desk attendant smiled professionally, confirmed my reservation, and handed me the key card for room 614. I thanked her. I crossed the lobby. I took the elevator to the 6th floor and walked down a carpeted hallway that absorbed the sound of my heels entirely, as though the building itself understood that I had used up everything I had tonight and had nothing left for noise. Room 614. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and closed it behind me. The room was exactly what I had booked. Clean, quiet, well-appointed, with a large window that looked out across the Houston skyline. The city lights spread out below in amber, and white, the kind of view that under different circumstances might have felt romantic or expansive. Tonight, it just looked like a world that was still running while mine had stopped. I slipped off my heels at the door. I walked to the window in my bare feet and stood there for a long time, looking out at the lights without really seeing them. My reflection looked back at me from the glass, the black dress, the soft bun now slightly undone from the evening, the face of a woman who had held herself together with extraordinary precision for 3 days and had just spent the last of what that precision required. For the first time in years, I saw myself clearly without Lucas beside me, without any shadow hiding the loneliness that had long slept inside me. I sat on the edge of the bed, and then I cried. I mean, the real kind of cry that comes from somewhere deeper than sadness, the kind that is equal parts grief and fury and exhaustion, and the specific devastating pain of a woman who is finally, after months of sensing something wrong and refusing to name it, arrived at the full, unvarnished truth of her own life. I cried for the 20 years I had invested in loving Anthony. I cried for the woman I had been at 23 when I chose Anthony, young and independent, and certain that love, if you gave it fully and faithfully, would come back to you in the same measure you sent it out. I cried for every season I had carried more than my share and called it partnership, for the months of freelance work and rebuilt savings and hospital waiting rooms. I cried for the betrayal. I cried for the lies dressed up as romance, for the flowers and wine that now felt like props in a performance I didn't know I was watching. I cried for every moment I thought I was chosen, cherished, and secured. For every night I believed I was loved. And all along, I was being quietly edged out. Not because I failed, not because I wasn't enough, but because someone younger, newer, and painfully Another man's wife had caught his attention and gave him temporary pleasure that made him forget the woman who stayed when life was heavy. That's what broke me. Not just that he strayed, but that while I was loving him honestly, he was already rehearsing a life without me. I cried for Susan too. God, I don't know how to just describe how shattered I was. Anthony's betrayal was devastating, but it was a betrayal the world has a name for. A cheating husband. But Susan's betrayal was different, and it cut deeper. My fellow woman, gosh, I had seen her at her lowest. I had listened to her fears, sat with her insecurities, and tried to help her feel whole again. I opened my home to her. I went an extra mile to make sure she got the job and became gainfully employed. Not long after that, she started working in his company. She started seeing him while I was welcoming her into my home, asking about her new job, and encouraging her. She was building something with my husband behind my back. I thought I was supporting a fellow woman finding her footing. All the while, she was finding comfort in my marriage. That's the part that hurt the most. Not just that she betrayed me, but that she let me care for her while she was helping to dismantle my marriage. She didn't just betray me. She let me cheer her on while she was quietly stepping into my place. Gosh, how mean can some people be? I don't know how long I sat on that bed. Long enough for the city lights outside to blur through the water in my eyes and clear again multiple times. Long enough for the grief to move through its different rooms, the anger room, the disbelief room, and the room that was simply very, very sad. I let it move. I did not try to manage it or redirect it or tell myself I was stronger than this. I was strong enough to have planned and executed 3 of the hardest days of my life without flinching. I could afford to not be strong for 1 hour in a hotel room where nobody could see me. Anthony called twice while I was sitting there. I watched his name on the screen both times and let it ring out. I had nothing to say to him tonight. Everything I needed to say had been said in that private room at Maison Verlaine, and anything he wanted to say to me now was coming from a place of panic rather than understanding, and I was not interested in managing his panic tonight. Tonight was mine. I was still sitting in the armchair by the window, a pillow pulled to my chest, eyes burning from crying when I heard a knock on the door. I walked over and peered through the peephole. It was Peter. He stood in the corridor in his dark jacket, hands in his pockets, his hair slightly undone from the way it had been at dinner. He looked like a man who had been sitting somewhere alone for the past hour and had eventually run out of places to put his thoughts. I opened the door slightly. We looked at each other for a moment without speaking. There was nothing performative about that silence. It was simply 2 people who had just been through the same storm from different sides of it, taking a moment to confirm that the other one was still standing. "I'm sorry to come here," he said. His voice was quiet and slightly rough at the edges. "I didn't wish to bother you, but I didn't know where else to go. I drove around for a while. And then I just realized that I needed to talk to someone who understands my pains." He stopped and shook his head slightly and said, "I'm sorry. If you don't want me here, I can leave." "Come in," I said. I opened the door wider, and he stepped inside. I gestured to the armchair by the window and took the one across from it, tucking my feet beneath me. Outside, Houston kept moving, cars passing on the street below, the skyline holding its lights steady, the ordinary machinery of a city that did not know or care that 2 people were sitting in a 6th-floor hotel room, trying to figure out what remained of their lives. Peter sat with his elbows on his knees and his hands loosely clasped and looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked up at me. "How did you sit through dinner like that?" he said, "knowing everything you knew, talking to me about project development and community planning." He let out a short, humorless breath that was almost a laugh. "How did you do that?" I thought about it honestly before answering. "I had 3 days to prepare," I said, and I had decided that losing my composure was not something I was willing to give them. Some truths land harder when they are delivered quietly. I wanted them to see me completely in control. I wanted that to be the last image they had of me in that room. Peter nodded slowly. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How long did you know?" "Since Tuesday evening," I replied. "3 days ago." He absorbed that. "And you just held it together for 3 days," he said. "I held it together until about 40 minutes ago." I replied, "Honestly, after I came to this hotel, I sat on that bed and fell apart completely." Something in his expression shifted. Not pity, something more honest than that, but the recognition that we both had been betrayed by our respective spouses. "I trusted her completely," he said. "I really trusted Susan, so much that I could swear with my life that she could never cheat on me. But unfortunately, she proved me wrong." He paused a bit and asked, "Was I naive and stupid?" "No," I said. "It is what trust looks like when it is real. The problem was never your trust. The problem was what she did with it." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, a car passed on the street below, its headlights sweeping briefly across the ceiling of the room. "I keep thinking about small things," he said. "Specific moments. A Saturday morning 3 weeks ago, she was in the kitchen making coffee, and I came up behind her, and she flinched, just slightly. And I thought, she's tired. She didn't hear me come in. I didn't think anything else of it." He looked at his hands. "Now I'm going back through everything and rearranging it." "I know," I said, because I did. I had spent 4 days doing exactly that, taking ordinary moments and holding them up to new light and watching them become something other than what I had believed they were. It is one of the cruelest parts, the retroactive rewriting. He nodded. We sat with that for a moment. I gave Anthony everything I had. I said eventually, I was there through every hard season of our marriage. I held things together when they should have been shared, and I helped Susan because I thought she needed it, and I was in a position to give it. I looked at the city lights outside the window and continued. I don't regret helping her. I regret that she was the kind of person who could accept that help and do what she did simultaneously. That is not something I could have known, but it is something I will be slower to forget. Peter looked at me. You're not what I expected, he said. What did you expect? He thought about it for a while and said, I expected someone angrier, maybe, or more broken. I am angry, I said, and I am broken in the way that anyone would be. But I decided a long time ago, before Tuesday, before any of this, that I was not going to be the kind of woman who lets what other people do to her become the most defining thing about her. I paused. I am going to file for divorce. He did not look surprised. Yes, he said, quietly, as though confirming something he had already decided for himself. And you? He looked at the window for a long moment. The city lights caught in his eyes. I don't think I can live with someone who can pretend that well. He said, I'm not sure I'd ever be able to look at her again without wondering which version I was seeing. So, I am filing a divorce too. I understood that completely. I'm not angry at Anthony the way I expected to be. I said, I thought I would be furious. I thought it would feel like rage. But what I actually feel is clarity. Like for the first time in 20 years, I am seeing Anthony for who he is. A cheat, a liar, and an unappreciative husband. Peter was quiet for a long time after that. Then he said, thank you for not letting me keep living in a lie. He said it simply and directly, and trust me, it was one of the most honest things anyone had said to me in a very long time. You deserve to know, I said, the same way I did. We talked for another hour, like two strangers who shared the same wound. He told me about how he had loved his wife fiercely, and how hurt he was that she repaid him with betrayal, And I told him that the problem was not how either of us had loved. The problem was who we had loved. At some minute past midnight, he stood to leave. He told me that he booked a room on the 4th floor to stay and calm his nerves. At the door, he paused and turned back. If you need a friend to help you get through this, someone who understands exactly how you feel, I'm here. I nodded. Thank you, Peter. He left. I stood at the door for a moment after it closed and listened to his footsteps recede down the carpeted hallway. And then I walked to the window and stood in the quiet of room 614, looking out at the Houston skyline. In that moment, I felt someone understood me better than my husband did in almost a decade. Someone who has been in my shoes and knows how painful betrayal is. I did not feel strong. I want to be clear about that because I think the story of a woman who handles betrayal with grace can too easily become a story about a woman who does not really hurt. And that is not true, and it is not fair to the truth. I hurt enormously. What I had lost that week was not just a marriage. It was a version of my life I had believed in completely, a version of myself I had organized around a relationship that had been quietly, methodically hollowed out from the inside, while I was still living in it. But beneath the hurt, something else had settled. Anthony could beg, he could promise to change, he could tell me that he had broken up with Susan, and he could even write hundreds of apology emails just to get to my heart. But it wouldn't work because my heart had closed to him the moment I saw the way he looked at Susan, the way he used to look at me, and made her feel the same way he had made me feel before she came into the picture. I loved him, and he broke that. So right now, I am choosing myself even if it hurts. Whatever comes next, it will be built on ground that is actually solid. The following morning, I returned to the house in the Houston suburbs where Anthony and I had lived for 20 years, not to hold on, but to clear out what remained of a marriage that had silently ended long ago. Anthony was already there, sitting on the couch in yesterday's clothes, hair undone, eyes red-rimmed, the posture of a man who had not slept and had spent the night rehearsing a speech, or rather, lies he hoped would change things. He stood the moment I walked in. Esther, he called out. Sit down, Anthony. I said. He sat. He told me he was sorry. He told me he knew what he had destroyed. He told me that he would go for counseling, be completely transparent, and he would immediately and permanently distance from Susan. His voice cracked in places that might once have moved me. I let him finish. Then I said, I called your mother. I called your cousin and your niece. I even called your college friends and the colleagues you were always so desperate to impress. I told them the truth, that for nearly a year you cheated on me, that the late meetings were lies, that the client dinners were hotel rooms, that while I was at home cooking for you and waiting up, you were holding another man's wife. When I finished, he looked at me like I had set his world on fire. Esther, you've destroyed my reputation, he said. His voice was shaking, but it wasn't from guilt. It was fear. Do you know what this will do to me? Do you know the negative impact this will have on my reputation and my firm? Do you even know how my friends will start to see me? They will avoid me and think their wives and girlfriends are not safe with me. I looked at him, irritated by his performance. You care more about your reputation than your marriage? Then let me remind you, you destroyed it. I said simply, I just stopped covering for it. He stepped toward me and tried to take my hand, the same hand that used to squeeze his own, just to reassure him that all was well. But now, that same hand was cold and hostile toward him. Clara, please. I love you, he said, kneeling. I stepped back a bit and said, Anthony, do you even know the true meaning of love? If you loved me, you would not have called another woman baby while I was asleep beside you. If you loved me, you would not have looked at her the way you used to look at me. If you loved me, I would not be standing here trying to breathe through this kind of pain. He collapsed to the floor, his shoulders shaking, and said, "She meant nothing to me. It was a mistake." I interrupted him immediately. "Anthony, it was not a mistake. It was a decision. 100 decisions. You had the chance to stop, but you didn't. Every text you sent, every reservation you made, every lie you told, well, I trusted you without question. You made your choice without considering my feelings, Anthony. And now I have made mine too, and no one, not even you, can stop me." He held my hand and said, "Please, if you leave, you'll ruin my life." "No, I am not ruining your life," I said, my eyes locked on his. "The one thing I will not do," I said, "is stay in a house where I have to pretend that love is enough reason to abandon my own dignity. I learned that the hard way. I will not learn it twice." I picked up my purse and walked out, leaving him in his own mess. The weeks that followed were not easy. I will not pretend otherwise. Healing is not a straight line, and it is not quiet. There were nights in my new apartment on the east side of the city where the loneliness was physical, a weight in the chest, a silence in the rooms that felt accusatory rather than peaceful. There were mornings where the grief arrived before I was fully awake, and I lay in it for a while before I could move. But I had to move on. Lucas tried everything to win me back. He called until my phone went quiet. He had flowers delivered to my office, as if petals could soften what he had done. He even wrote a 4-page email about his clarity after that dinner, as though betrayal becomes wisdom overnight. I did not respond. I had lived on apologies long enough. This time, my silence was the only answer he deserved. I can never disrespect myself so much by sticking to a man who betrayed me without thinking about how I would feel. Peter still calls once in a while to check on me. I tell myself it is harmless, just two wounded people making sure the other survived the wreckage. I appreciate his voice more than I should, but every time we hang up, I sit there wondering how something born out of betrayal could possibly lead anywhere good. I have no idea what the future holds for us, and that uncertainty both comforts and frightens me. I hired a lawyer, and I filed for divorce. I went back to work. I took a weekend photography class because I had always meant to and had always found a reason not to. I painted the bedroom of my new apartment a shade of deep green. I had always loved it, and Anthony had always dismissed it as too dramatic. I bought plants and learned their names. I walked in the mornings along the bayou near my building, watching the city wake up, belonging entirely to me. The divorce was finalized 7 months after that Friday night at Maison Verlaine. I signed the papers on a Thursday afternoon in my lawyer's downtown office and walked out into the Houston streets with a folder of documents under my arm and the particular disorienting lightness of a woman who has just legally closed a chapter she had been living inside for 20 years. The sun was low and warm on my face as I stood on the sidewalk outside the building. People moved past me in both directions, unhurried, absorbed in their own afternoons, completely unaware that the woman standing still in the middle of all that movement had just finished dismantling the life she had spent 2 decades building. I stood there for a long moment, and then I walked to my car, drove to my new apartment on the east side of the city, made a cup of tea, and sat on my small balcony watching the Houston skyline in the fading light. I did not feel destroyed. I want to be honest about that because I think people expect a woman in my position to feel destroyed, and the absence of that destruction can feel like something that needs explaining. I felt hollowed out in places. Yes, I felt the specific grief of 20 years of investment that had not returned what it should have. I felt the tenderness of someone who has recently been through something that required everything she had. But underneath all of that, I felt like myself. I felt like I had regained my power, my respect, and my dignity. A few weeks after the divorce was finalized, a close friend called me on a Sunday evening. She had seen Anthony and Susan at a cafe in the suburbs. A small place neither of them would have chosen when they were still hiding, which told me that the hiding was over, and the reality of what they had chosen had fully arrived. My friend said they did not look the way she expected two people who had blown up two marriages for each other to look. They looked tired with little or no attraction for each other. I thanked her for telling me. And I meant it genuinely, not because the information gave me satisfaction, but because it confirmed something I had already understood, that what Anthony and Susan had was never what they believed it was. It had been constructed entirely in the shadow of something stolen, and things built in shadows rarely survive the light. 1 week after that phone call, a message arrived from Anthony. This was the last one I ever received from him. He had written it in the careful, slightly formal way of a man who has rehearsed something multiple times and is still not sure he has found the right words. I tried to move forward with Susan. I genuinely tried, but there is nothing there that works without the thing I destroyed to get it. She cannot replace you. I don't see you in her eyes. I don't see anything in her eyes anymore. If I could take back the hands of time, then I would do that without hesitation. I know this is not something you want to hear, and I know I have no right to send it. I just needed you to know that I understand finally and completely that I lost a diamond while chasing stones. I read it twice. Then I set the phone face down on the kitchen counter and finished making my dinner. I did not respond, not out of cruelty. I want to be clear about that. There was no satisfaction in Anthony's pain, no quiet vindication in the knowledge that what he had chosen had not given him what he thought it would. I simply had nothing left to say to him that I had not already said in that private room at Maison Verlaine, and reopening the conversation would not have served either of us. His message was for him, not for me. It was the message of a man trying to process his own regret, and that was something he was going to have to do without my participation. A few days after that, I noticed his social media accounts had been deactivated. A mutual connection mentioned, without elaborating, that he had temporarily stepped back from his position on a professional board for personal reasons. Anthony had always been a man who lived for the image he projected, the successful partner, the polished professional, the man people respected at events and admired at dinners. To watch that image quietly dismantle itself from a distance because of an extramarital affair was not something I celebrated. It was simply something I observed, with the detached clarity of a woman who had already moved on from the life he had chosen and the consequences it had produced. Spring came earlier than usual that year. I was standing at the kitchen counter making coffee, still wearing the oversized shirt I had slept in, my hair undone, when my phone rang. I looked at the screen. It was Peter. When I answered, his voice was calm as he spoke. "Coffee at Diamond Stones?" he asked. I glanced at the clock. It was 10 o'clock. I did not even hesitate. "Give me 15 minutes," I said, already reaching for my keys. Since that night, we openly confronted our spouses over the affair they were having with each other. Peter and I have stayed in touch. We started with simple check-in texts, just making sure the other was okay. A question about the divorce process, since we were both navigating it simultaneously. Then it became something more regular, coffee on Saturday mornings, occasional walks along the bayou, and the kind of easy, honest company that two people can share when they have watched their marriages collapse, seen each other at their absolute lowest, and were trying to figure out who they were afterward. Peter was not complicated or exhausting to understand. He was kind, thoughtful, and a great listener. Just like me, he was learning how to live in a life that had been rearranged without his consent, which made being around him feel easy in a way that needed no explanation. That morning, he was already at our usual table. When I arrived, the corner one by the window, 2 lattes already waiting, his notebook open on the table with the particular casual readiness of a man who carries his thoughts around with him everywhere he goes. He looked up when I walked in and smiled. I guessed right, he said, sliding one of the lattes toward me. You always do, I said, sitting down and wrapping both hands around the warm cup. Anthony got my coffee order wrong for 20 years. We both laughed at that, not the painful, complicated laughter of two people making dark jokes to survive, something lighter than that, something that had moved past survival and into something that felt cautiously and genuinely like living. How are you? I asked. He nodded slowly, the way people nod when they are confirming something to themselves as much as answering a question. The divorce was finalized last week. He said, how did it feel? He thought about it honestly, which was one of the things I had come to appreciate about Peter. He did not give automatic answers. Strange, he said, but necessary and sad. It's not really about Susan, though. It's more about the future I thought I would have, the life I imagined, which is the version of myself as a husband growing old in that marriage. Unfortunately, that version of my life isn't happening, and I'm still trying to accept that. I understood that completely. The grief of a future that no longer exists is one of the quieter losses in the aftermath of a marriage ending, less visible than the anger, less dramatic than the confrontation, but in some ways more persistent. Susan left a note when she moved out. He continued. She said she was sorry for making me lose faith in love. I looked at him. And did she make you lose faith in love? He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quietness that means something is being considered and thought through. Then he met my eyes. No, he said, because I am learning to believe again, not in promises. I think I am done with promises for a while, but in small, consistent actions, in showing up, in the difference between what someone says and what they actually do. He paused. In coffee that arrives before you ask for it. I looked down at the latte in my hands. I did not say anything. I did not need to. In that particular, comfortable silence, I understood that whatever was growing between us, slowly, without pressure, without either of us trying to name it or rush it toward a destination, it was something real, something built on a foundation that neither of us had chosen, but both of us had survived. The months that followed settled into a rhythm that felt, for the first time in a long time, genuinely mine. I returned to my work at the firm with a focus and energy I had not brought to it in years, freed from the low, constant hum of a troubled marriage. I found that I had more of myself available for everything else. I enrolled in a weekend photography class I had been meaning to take for the better part of a decade. I walked in the mornings. I kept my apartment full of plants whose names I had looked up and learned and taken small, unreasonable pride in. I had dinner with friends on my own terms without coordinating around Anthony's schedule or preferences or moods. I lived, in other words, like a person who belonged to herself. Peter and I continued to see each other through those months, more regularly and more easily, the friendship deepening in the way that good things deepen when you are not forcing them. He began attending an industry networking group I was part of, and watching him in professional settings, clear, measured, and genuinely engaged with the people around him, I felt something I recognized from the early days of my marriage, but with a different quality to it. Less dazzled, more certain. 2 years after the divorce, Peter and I were walking along the bayou after an outdoor concert in the park nearby. He suddenly stopped walking and looked at me with an expression I had not seen on his face before. Serious, quiet, entirely undefended. Esther, he said, I am not in a rush. I want to say that first because I mean it. I am not trying to push you toward anything before you are ready for it. But I want to be honest with you because honesty is the only thing I have decided I am interested in. He paused. If there is ever a day when you want to try something again, not a promise that covers something hollow underneath, not a deceitful relationship, just a true relationship that is built entirely on trust and no secrets and showing up consistently. I am ready for that. Whenever you are, or never, if that is what you need. Either way, I am not going anywhere. 2 years had passed since that night at Maison Verlaine. 2 years since we had sat in 2 armchairs in a hotel room and talked about what it costs to trust someone completely and have that trust treated as something exploitable. 2 years of slow, honest, unforced friendship that had rebuilt something in me I had not known was still available for rebuilding. I looked at him for a long moment. His eyes held no pressure, only patience and sincerity. Then I said, I am not ready to love the old way, the way I loved Anthony, where I gave everything and asked nothing and convinced myself that was virtue. I cannot do that again. I do not want to do that again. Peter nodded. He had expected that answer, I think. But the way you are describing it, I said slowly, starting from what we already have, honesty, showing up, no hiding. I paused. I think I may have already started without realizing I had made the decision. Peter said nothing. He reached out and quietly took my hands, the way you reach for something you have been careful with and intend to remain careful with. His hands were warm and steady, and they did not make grand promises or anything beyond what this moment actually was. It simply said, I am here. I am not pretending, and I am not going anywhere. If anyone was going to help write my next chapter, it was the man standing before me, and under the soft lights, with a breeze brushing over the water, I knew I was stepping into something quiet, imperfect, but real. And this time, I wouldn't have to sacrifice my self-worth to keep love, because the person beside me had once shattered, too. And now, we were both rebuilding from those very pieces. We stood on the bayou path in the early summer evening with the water moving quietly beside us and the city lights beginning to come on in the distance. And I felt something settle in my chest that I had not felt in a very long time. Not the giddy, unexamined certainty of a 23-year-old who believes love is simple because she has not yet learned that it is not. Something quieter and more durable than that. The feeling of a woman who has been through the full depth of what love can cost and has arrived on the other side at something she can actually trust. A year after Peter and I officially started our relationship, I received an invitation to a retirement celebration for Margaret Osei, a senior partner at a firm I had collaborated with for over a decade, a woman I deeply respected, and one of those rare professionals who manages to be both formidably accomplished and genuinely warm without any contradiction between the two. The event was held at the Grandeur Hotel downtown. Elegant and understated in the way that well-organized celebrations for accomplished women tend to be, I arrived early in a simple navy dress, my mother's pearl earrings, and a small wrapped gift under my arm. I was looking forward to an evening of good conversation and the particular pleasure of celebrating someone who had earned everything being celebrated. I was not expecting to see Anthony. He was standing near the drinks table when I entered the ballroom. Thinner than I remembered, the gray at his temples more pronounced, his posture carrying a quietness that had not been there when I knew him. He still looked polished in the superficial sense, good jacket, careful grooming, but the confidence that had once been so central to how he occupied a room was absent. He looked like a man who had been humbled by something and was still in the process of deciding what to do with that. He saw me at the same moment I saw him. We both paused, just briefly, just the fraction of a second that two people need when they encounter someone who was once the center of their lives and is now simply a person in a room. He walked over, wine glass in hand, measured steps, and the careful approach of a man who is not sure of his reception. Esther, he said. His voice was rougher than I remembered. I didn't know you would be here. I didn't know you would be here either, I replied, keeping my tone even and not unkind. He gave a small, tired smile. Margaret was one of the few people who stayed in touch with me after everything. I think she believes in second chances more than most. She always has. I said. It is one of the things I admire about her. Anthony looked at me for a moment, not with the desperate, searching intensity of the man who had sat on our couch in yesterday's clothes begging me to stay, but with something older and more settled, the look of a man who has had time to sit with what he did and has stopped trying to negotiate his way out of it. I owe you an apology, he said quietly, a real one. Not because I think you need it from me. I think you are probably well past needing anything from me. But because I need to say it, because I have spent 2 years understanding in full what I destroyed. And I think the least I owe you is the honesty of saying that plainly to your face without asking you for anything in return. I said nothing. I let him continue. I lost more than I expected. He said, not just the marriage, not just the friendships and the professional standing, though I lost those too. I lost my own self-respect. The relationship with Susan was over within months. It had been built entirely on the wrong foundation, and it could not hold its own weight once the secrecy was gone. He paused. I tried to hold on to it for a while. I think I needed to believe it had been worth something, but it wasn't. It was never what I told myself it was. I know, I said simply, are you well? Are you genuinely okay? Yes, I said, without hesitation. I am genuinely okay, Anthony. I am better than okay. I am building a life I actually recognize as mine, and I am not building it alone. As I said it, I felt a hand come to rest lightly at the small of my back. I turned. Peter stood beside me in a charcoal shirt and a well-cut blazer, his expression easy and warm. He had arrived exactly when he said he would. He always did. Anthony's eyes moved from my face to Peter's and back again, and I watched him understand. He nodded once, slowly the nod of a man genuinely reckoning with something rather than performing graciousness. He's a good man, Anthony said quietly. I can see it. He paused. You deserve that. A good man and a fresh start. I looked at my former husband. This man I had loved faithfully for 20 years. This man I had carried through his darkest seasons. This man who had repaid all of it in the worst possible way. And I felt, with a completeness that surprised me with its gentleness, nothing but the quiet finality of a door that had been properly, fully closed. Thank you, I said sincerely. And so do you, Anthony, when you are genuinely ready, not to fill a space, but to actually show up for someone and not to take their love for granted. I hope you find that. He stepped back, gave me the space to move forward. And I did. That evening, Peter and I sat side by side at a table with people I genuinely liked, eating good food and laughing at things that were actually funny. And later we danced slowly under the warm gold light of a ballroom full of people celebrating a woman who had built something real and lasting. There were no grand declarations that night, no speeches about what we had been through or what we had become to each other. Just two people who had once been strangers united by the worst night of their lives and were now rebuilding, not from scratch, but from cracks healed with time and trust. As we left the hotel, I took Peter's hand on the front steps, and we walked into the warm Houston night together. Above us, the sky was clear and full of stars, the kind of sky that makes the city feel smaller and the world feel larger, and the future feel, despite everything, genuinely open. You know, I said softly, looking up. There was a time when I believed that what happened, the betrayal, all of it was the end of something, that I would spend the rest of my life recovering from it. Peter was quiet for a moment, his hand steady in mine. And now, I thought about it honestly. Now I think it was a pause, I said. A painful, necessary pause. The kind that forces you to stop and look at the direction you are walking in and decide, with full awareness, whether that is actually where you want to go. I paused. I walked away from that direction, and everything I have walked toward since then has been real. Peter squeezed my hand gently. We walked on without looking back. The past was behind us, closed not with bitterness, but with the quiet, hard-won acceptance of two people who had been through the fire and had chosen, on the other side of it, to build something that could not be burned. The present was warm and honest and entirely our own, and the future, unhurried, unscripted, built on the only foundation either of us trusted anymore, was unfolding gently in every step we took together into that clear Houston night. For years after I divorced Anthony, I was no longer the woman who gave 20 years to a man who saw her loyalty as something he could afford to waste. I was Esther, strong, steady, and free. I had not just survived the betrayal. I had walked through it and come out the other side knowing exactly who I was and exactly what I would and would not accept from the people I chose to love. Betrayal had broken me, but it had also, in the way that only the most painful things can, led me back to myself. And in the end, that was the only place I had ever needed to go. If this story has taught me anything, if it has taught you anything, I hope it is this. Your loyalty is not weakness. The fact that you showed up faithfully, that you loved without conditions, and that you gave everything you had to the people you chose, none of that was wrong. Do not let what someone did with your loyalty convince you that the loyalty itself was the problem. It was never the problem. The problem was that it was given to someone who did not know its value. But here is the harder truth, the one that took me the longest to accept. You cannot keep giving your best to people who have shown you clearly and repeatedly that they are not going to protect it. Loyalty is a virtue. Loyalty without boundaries is a slow surrender of yourself. And you are too important, your peace, your dignity, your sense of self, to be surrendered for the comfort of someone who stopped valuing you a long time ago. Know your worth, not in the abstract, motivational poster way that phrase is often used, but in the practical, daily decision-making way. Know it when you are deciding whether to stay in a situation that is diminishing you. Know it when someone's actions are telling you something different from their words. Know it when the version of yourself you have become inside a relationship is smaller and quieter and more uncertain than the person you were before it. You are allowed to leave things that are not good for you. You are allowed to walk away from relationships, from situations, from versions of your life that no longer reflect who you actually are. Walking away is not failure. Sometimes walking away is the most courageous and self-respecting thing a person can do. And forgiveness. I want to say something about forgiveness because it is often misunderstood in stories like mine. I did not forgive Anthony and Susan in the traditional sense of that word. I did not arrive at a place of warmth or goodwill toward what they did. What I arrived at was something different, and I believe more honest acceptance. I accepted that it happened. I accepted that I could not change it. I accepted that carrying rage and bitterness forward into my new life would mean allowing people who had already taken enough from me to take my future as well. That was not something I was willing to give them. So I let it go. Not for them. For me. There is a version of moving on that requires forgiveness, and a version that simply requires acceptance and the decision to stop letting the past have more space in your present than it deserves. Find whichever version allows you to breathe. Find whichever version gives you your life back. And then go live it fully, honestly, on your own terms, with people who see your value and treat it accordingly. You deserve nothing less than that. Not eventually. Not once you have proven yourself or healed enough or found the right person. Right now, exactly as you are. If you have made it to the end of this story, I want to take a moment to speak to you directly. Maybe you watched this because you were curious. Maybe you watched because something in the title caught your attention and would not let go. Or maybe, and I think this is true for more of you than will say it out loud, you watched because something in this story felt familiar. because you recognized something in Esther's silence, in her careful composure, in the years of showing up for someone who was quietly, consistently failing to show up for her. If that is you, I want you to know that you are not alone. What you are feeling, the confusion, the grief, the strange combination of devastation and relief that comes with finally seeing the truth, is real and it is valid, and it does not make you weak. It makes you human. You do not have to have it all figured out today. You do not have to know what the next chapter looks like in order to close the current one. You just have to be willing to be honest with yourself about what is real, about what you need, and about what you deserve. Start there. Everything else follows from that. Thank you, genuinely, from the bottom of my heart, for spending this time with us today to hear Esther's story, for listening, for staying, for caring enough about someone else's truth to sit with it all the way to the end. Stories like this one exist because real women live them, survive them, and come out the other side with something hard-won and valuable to offer the rest of us. Every time you watch, every time you share, every time you pass a story like this one along to someone who needs it, you are part of that. If this story moved you, if it made you think or feel or see something differently, please leave a comment below and tell us what it meant to you. Your words matter more than you know, and this community is built on them. And if you are not yet subscribed to this channel, please do so now. We tell stories here that are worth telling, stories about strong women navigating real pain and finding, on the other side of it, something genuine and lasting. There is more to come, and we do not want you to miss a single one. Until next time, be honest, be brave, and above all, choose yourself, because you are always worth choosing. Take care of yourself and stay safe. I love you all.